The first thing you notice about Lake Silverwood is how calm it looks. A mirror of blue, stretching into the horizon, reflecting the sun like some postcard-perfect resort. But beneath that calm surface, chaos, conflict, and a story that starts with destruction. It was a hot summer morning when Marcus Reynolds stepped out onto what remained of his property. Dirt dusted his boots, sweat dripped from his forehead, and the smell of burnt wood still lingered in the air. His barn, the barn that had been in his family for generations, was gone. Demolished, flattened, reduced to splintered wood and broken dreams. And why? Because the Homeowners Association, or HOA, as they like to call themselves, said it violated property codes. Never mind that Marcus had grown up on this land, worked this property, poured every ounce of sweat and love into it. Never mind that this barn had been a place where his father taught him how to fix engines, where Marcus had learned the value of hard work. The HOA didn't care. Their brand new, pristine resort homes and landscape lakefront mattered more. Marcus clenched his fists as he stared at the jagged remains. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust and fresh paint from the neighboring vacation homes. The sound of children laughing somewhere down the hill, families enjoying their weekend getaway, grated on his nerves. It was like the world was moving on while he was left behind in ruins. He walked toward the edge of his property, where a small, muddy trail led down to the lake. There, hidden by reeds and brush, was an old dam valve. Rusted, overgrown, barely functional, but it was there. And for the first time, an idea flickered in his mind. One that was dangerous. One that could change everything. But Marcus wasn't thinking about danger just yet. He was thinking about injustice. "This isn't right," he muttered under his breath. His voice was rough, edged with anger and disbelief. "They can't just tear down everything I've built." He thought back to the meeting a week ago. The HOA president, a man named Gerald Simmons, had leaned back in his leather chair, looking more like a banker than someone in charge of a community. "Marcus," Gerald had said, voice smooth, rehearsed, polished, "we're enforcing the rules equally. That barn doesn't meet code. It's a safety issue, I'm sure you understand." Marcus remembered how calm he tried to stay, how he'd sat there, gripping the edge of the table, teeth clenched. "Understand?" he had asked. "I grew up here. That barn's been here for decades. It's part of this land. But rules are rules." Gerald had shrugged. "We can't make exceptions." "I'm sorry." Marcus had left that room feeling small, powerless, invisible. And now, standing among the ruins of his family's barn, the weight of that helplessness pressed down like the summer sun overhead. He kicked a chunk of splintered wood and let out a bitter laugh. "Rules, huh? Rules for them. Not for me." That's when he noticed the water. Lake Silverwood, calm and pristine, lapped quietly at the edges of the HOA's resort property. And there it was, the old valve, barely noticeable, tucked behind the reeds and overgrown brush. Rusted metal, corroded hinges, a relic from a time before the HOA bought the land and built their luxury cottages. He crouched down, brushing away moss and dirt with his sleeve. His heart beat faster. He wasn't thinking clearly yet, just reacting to the injustice, the anger, the frustration. But the valve seemed powerful, like an opportunity. The air shifted. A cool breeze rippled the surface of the lake, carrying the faint scent of pine and something metallic. Somewhere down the hill, someone laughed. A carefree, ignorant laugh. Marcus's jaw tightened. That could have been him and his family enjoying the lake, before the HOA decided their enjoyment mattered more than his hard work. He stood and surveyed the scene. The barn was gone. His tools, his equipment, his father's old workbench, all either buried under the rubble or hauled away by the HOA's contractors. And yet, the lake, the valve, the water itself, they hadn't touched him yet. Marcus clenched his fists again. He wasn't thinking about the law. He wasn't thinking about consequences. He was thinking about fairness, about justice, about sending a message that no one could just destroy a man's life and expect him to take it quietly. "You want to see if I play by your rules?" he whispered to himself. I'll show you rules. A sudden sound made him freeze. The crunch of gravel under boots, the sharp bark of a dog, a low voice calling somewhere from the resort. Marcus ducked behind a tree, through the branches. He saw them, the whole board members, walking along the lakefront, clipboards in hand, talking and laughing like nothing had happened, like the destruction of his barn wasn't their responsibility. Something inside Marcus snapped. Anger, righteous and burning, surged through him. The image of his father, teaching him to respect the land, to protect what's yours. It all came rushing back. He could feel the old bloodlines, the history, the sweat, the legacy of his family demanding action. He glanced at the valve again. Just one turn, just a small action. The kind of move that could shake things up, force people to take notice. And maybe, just maybe, make them feel a fraction of the frustration, helplessness, and anger he had felt for the past week. Marcus took a deep breath. The air smelled of water, earth, and tension. He could hear the faint lapping of the lake against the shore. His hands hovered over the rusty valve handle, heart pounding, pulse racing, mind spinning. And then he heard a voice behind him, a voice that wasn't meant to be there. Marcus, what are you doing? He froze. Footsteps approaching fast. And at that moment, the summer day, the quiet lake, the ruined barn, all of it seemed to hold its breath. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't move. The valve waited. The lake waited. And for the first time in days, he felt alive. Because sometimes, justice doesn't wait politely. Sometimes it demands action. And Marcus Reynolds was about to take that first step. Marcus's mind raced as the voice behind him echoed through the reeds. He didn't turn immediately. Didn't want to show fear or hesitation. The man standing there wasn't one of the whole board members. It was his neighbor, old Mr. Jenkins, a retired engineer who had lived in the area for decades. A man who knew the land like the back of his hand. Marcus, this isn't you, Jenkins said, voice low but firm. You're thinking about that valve like it's, I don't know, a weapon. It's water. It's dangerous. Marcus swallowed hard. The anger hadn't left. It was still a fire in his chest. But Jenkins' voice reminded him of reason. For a split second, he remembered what his mother used to tell him. Fight smart, not just hard. I know what I'm doing, Mr. Jenkins, Marcus said, finally turning to face him. I didn't come out here to hurt anyone. Just to make them see what they did. His voice wavered slightly, betraying the storm inside. Jenkins shook his head. Marcus, I get it. I really do. But don't let anger make you reckless. They demolished your barn. They think they can steamroll you. But there's another way. Marcus clenched his jaw. Another way? Like calling the police? Like suing? Like waiting for justice to trickle down while they sip champagne by the lake? Jenkins sighed, looking toward the pristine water, shimmering in the sunlight. I've lived here long enough to see what happens when people get desperate. Don't underestimate water. Don't underestimate consequences. One wrong turn, and everything you care about could disappear, including you. Marcus's chest tightened. He knew Jenkins was right. He wasn't stupid, but he wasn't backing down either. Not now. Not after everything. The story of Marcus Reynolds didn't start with this barn. It started decades ago in this very town, in a neighborhood where Black families had worked hard to build lives that were constantly challenged by systemic bias. Marcus grew up running barefoot across these fields, fixing tractors, learning carpentry from his father, and listening to his mother lecture about fairness, dignity, and self-respect. When he inherited the land, it wasn't just property, it was history, memories, blood, sweat, and tears built into every board, every nail, every corner of that barn. And to see it torn down because a handful of wealthy homeowners wanted a lakefront aesthetic, it wasn't just theft, it was erasure. The HOA had claimed codes, regulations, safety violations. Marcus knew those were just excuses. Excuses to displace him, to favor the newcomers with their fancy houses, manicured lawns, and weekend retreats. He tried to fight them the first time, politely, Letters, meetings, emails, everything. They'd ignored him, dismissed him, laughed him off as a troublesome neighbor. And now, standing amidst the rubble, he realized the polite route hadn't worked. "Marcus," Jenkins said again, breaking through his spiraling thoughts. "They're counting on you to lose your temper. Don't give them that satisfaction." But Marcus wasn't thinking about satisfaction. He was thinking about accountability, about making the whole understand that destroying someone's life had consequences. He glanced at the valve again. Rust, moss, and overgrowth aside, it was functional. A relic from an older era, before development took over. A dam control valve, capable of diverting water from the lake. It was his property. Technically, though the HOA's resort touched its edges. One turn could redirect water, slow it, maybe flood a small section. Make them notice. Make them understand. "You don't think this is dangerous?" Marcus asked quietly. "Extremely," Jenkins said. "But that's why you need a plan, not just rage. Don't let this be a mistake you regret." Marcus swallowed. "I don't regret the barn, and I won't regret standing up for myself." Jenkins placed a hand on his shoulder. "I know. Just think it through. You're not alone in this." Marcus nodded, feeling the tiniest spark of hope. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone. The confrontation that triggered all this had happened just a few days before. Marcus had gone to the HOA office, trying to reason. "You have to remove that structure," Gerald Simmons had said, calm as ever, like he was discussing a parking permit instead of demolishing a man's livelihood. Marcus had leaned forward, slamming his hand on the desk. "Remove it? This barn is my life. My father built it. My grandfather before him." Gerald had tilted his head. "I understand it's personal, but regulations exist for a reason. Safety, community standards. It's non-negotiable." Marcus's voice had grown louder. "Non-negotiable? That's just code for, we can do whatever we want. You think because you have money and power, you can erase people's history?" A few board members in the room had exchanged awkward glances. Gerald, unshaken, had replied, "Rules are rules, Mr. Reynolds. We enforce them equally." But Marcus had known that wasn't true. A white homeowner down the street had added a shed last year without issue. No demolition, no fines. Just a quiet nod and approval. The hypocrisy burned in him like acid. That moment in the office, staring into Gerald's polished, smug face, had crystallized something in Marcus. The world wasn't fair, and sometimes, if justice didn't come to you, you had to create it. Back by the lake, Marcus crouched by the valve. He could feel the metal under his fingertips. Cold, rough, yet commanding. It represented potential, power, a small but significant way to turn the tables. Jenkins watched him, silent, cautious. "You think about this as a battle, Marcus. But battles aren't just about force. Strategy wins. Patience wins. Don't let your anger blind you." Marcus exhaled slowly. He wanted to yell, to curse, to charge at the HOA with the force of his fury. But Jenkins' words grounded him. He needed to be smart, calculated. He needed a plan. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a question gnawed at him. How far would he be willing to go to protect what was his? A gust of wind rippled across the lake, stirring the reeds, carrying with it the faint scent of the demolished barn. Marcus looked at the horizon, at the shiny resort homes, and at the families enjoying a day that should have been his. He realized something chilling. If he made a wrong move, this land, his life, everything he loved could be destroyed. But if he did nothing, nothing would ever change. The first confrontation had taught him two things. The HOA wouldn't stop, and neither would he. Marcus stood, wiping dirt and sweat from his arms. "I need a plan," he muttered, "and I need allies." Jenkins gave him a slow nod. "Then start smart. Step 1, understand your terrain. Step 2, know your enemy. Step 3, don't let emotions lead the way. This is bigger than just a barn, Marcus. Bigger than anger. Bigger than revenge." Marcus turned toward the lake again, the valve at his feet, the sun glinting off the resort homes. His chest tightened with resolve. The fight was just beginning, and the next move would be decisive. Somewhere down the hill, someone laughed again, blissfully unaware that Marcus Reynolds was no longer the quiet, polite neighbor. That the man who had once quietly fixed tractors and barns was now thinking in terms of strategy, consequence, and justice. And this time, he wasn't holding back. The days after the barn demolition were a blur for Marcus Reynolds. The air felt heavier, as though the sun itself carried judgment. His morning started early, wandering the edges of his property, inspecting the remnants of the barn, listening to the faint hum of the lake. Birds chirped, dogs barked, children laughed, and through it all, Marcus felt like an intruder in his own world. The hole wasn't subtle. Within 48 hours, a letter slid under his door, official and cold. Cease and desist. Trespass warnings. Further violations pending. The language was precise, legalistic, intended to intimidate. Marcus crumpled the paper in his fist and slammed it against the kitchen counter. The sound echoed through his small house like a shot. They think this will stop me? He muttered, pacing. This is my land, my life, my family's history. By now, word had spread through the small town. Neighbors whispered behind hands, passing judgment or sympathy in equal measure. Marcus had always been a quiet man, respected but not well known, until now. Suddenly, the story of the demolished barn had become a symbol of injustice, of privilege, of what happens when power is left unchecked. It was during a morning trip to the local hardware store that Marcus first ran into Gerald Simmons outside the HOA office. Gerald's presence was deliberate. Marcus could feel it like a punch to the chest. The man exuded confidence, arrogance, and the kind of entitlement that had protected him from consequences his entire life. Good morning, Marcus, Gerald said, smiling thinly as if the world had never been unfair to him. I see you're inspecting your property again. Marcus's jaw tightened. I'm making sure nothing else gets destroyed. Gerald shrugged. I'm just saying, sometimes resistance has consequences. You don't want to escalate things unnecessarily. I don't get to choose what's necessary, Marcus replied, voice low and dangerous. You made that choice when you sent your contractors to destroy my barn. A small crowd had gathered at a distance, sensing the tension. Some watched curiously, others disapprovingly. Marcus could feel the weight of their eyes, the unspoken judgment. And yet, Gerald didn't flinch, not even a hint of remorse in his perfectly pressed suit. Marcus, Gerald said, voice smooth, practiced. Rules are rules, and enforcement will continue if you continue to resist. Consider this a friendly warning. As Gerald walked away, Marcus clenched his fists, feeling the rage bubbling inside. This wasn't just personal anymore. It was systemic. The HOA, the regulations, the lawyers, they were all lined up against him. But he wasn't going to back down. Back home, Marcus dug through his father's old files and blueprints. The barn had been part of a larger system, connected in ways he had only vaguely understood as a kid. And there it was, the dam, the valve, the mechanism that controlled the lake's water. In the back of his mind, the idea he'd toyed with before grew sharper, more defined. He wasn't thinking about destruction for the sake of destruction. He was thinking about leverage. He was thinking about justice. He was thinking about making them understand that you can't erase someone's legacy without consequences. Then came the call from his attorney, a young, idealistic woman named Tasha Coleman. She had been following Marcus's case quietly, sensing there was more at stake than just a barn. Marcus, she said, her voice urgent. I've looked over the HOA's actions. They're walking a fine line legally. The demolition? Probably overreach. But here's the catch. You need to document everything. Every interaction, every threat, every letter. And be careful. They have resources. You don't. I know, Marcus replied. I'm not stupid. I'm thinking ahead. Good. Because things are about to get messy. I'd suggest caution, but I know that's not your style. Marcus smiled faintly, bitterly. Caution went out the window the day they tore down my barn. That afternoon, Marcus noticed new activity near the lake. Contractors, surveyors, engineers measuring water levels, checking the dam, making notes. Gerald Simmons was there, clipboard in hand, barking orders with that same polished arrogance. Marcus crouched in the trees at the edge of the property, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He could see the strategy forming. They weren't just maintaining the lake, they were preparing, in some way, to protect their resort, to control the narrative, to assert dominance. It felt personal, and it was. The first real confrontation came the next morning. Marcus decided to walk down to the lake, not hiding, not sneaking, just walking, calm, controlled, deliberate. Gerald spotted him immediately and called out, "Marcus, step away from the lake. You're trespassing." Marcus stopped, hands visible, posture unyielding. "I'm on my property." Gerald's face twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your property? The lake? That dam? Don't test the boundaries, Marcus. You're lucky I'm feeling generous today." "You don't get to decide what's generous," Marcus shot back. "I don't answer to you. I never have, and I never will." Gerald's jaw tightened. He waved a hand toward the contractors. "Get him off my property. Now." Marcus held his ground. "Try it. See what happens." For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The water shimmered. The birds went silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The confrontation wasn't just verbal. It was symbolic. A battle between history and privilege, between legacy and greed. Then one of the contractors stepped forward, a large man in a fluorescent vest, hands raised. "Sir, you need to leave. Please." Marcus's eyes darted toward the valve, hidden behind reeds. His mind raced with options. Every second Gerald lingered, every command shouted, every dismissive glance. These were openings. He didn't need to act recklessly. He needed to act strategically. And somewhere deep down, Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The hoe would escalate. Legal notices, fines, public shaming, everything they could throw at him. But he had something they didn't: knowledge, resourcefulness, and righteous anger fueled by decades of injustice. The first confrontation ended without physical violence, but it left a mark. Marcus returned to his home, mind buzzing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. He started mapping out the terrain in his head: paths, water flow, the valve mechanism, potential allies, potential risks. Every move counted. Every decision had weight. That night, he sat on the porch, watching the lights from the resort homes reflect off the lake. Families laughed. Couples held hands. Children ran barefoot on manicured lawns. And Marcus clenched his fists, staring at the reflection of the moon on the water. Justice, power, legacy, all tangled in one simple thought: if they think they can steamroll me, they're wrong. But he also knew that escalation had its costs. Mistakes could ruin him. Costs could come in legal fees, fines, or even injury. Yet doing nothing felt worse. The fire of injustice wouldn't allow it. And as the night deepened, Marcus made a silent promise. The next move would be his. Calculated, deliberate, unstoppable. Because the hoe had underestimated him. And they were about to find out why Marcus Reynolds wasn't just a man defending a barn. He was a man defending justice, dignity, and his family's legacy. The week after the confrontation passed in a haze of planning, observation, and quiet determination. Marcus Reynolds had become almost invisible in plain sight, walking his property, keeping an eye on the lake, noting every movement of the whole contractors, every shift in the patterns of the resort. Every detail mattered. Every opportunity could be leveraged. But nothing prepared him for the call that came that Tuesday evening. "Marcus, it's your attorney." Tasha Coleman's voice sounded urgent over the phone. "You need to sit down. Now." "What happened?" Marcus asked, pacing his living room. The hum of the ceiling fan did little to calm his racing heart. "They're taking it further," she said. "The hoe just filed an emergency injunction. They're claiming you're planning to interfere with the lake." If this goes through, you could be facing legal action that freezes your access to your own property. Marcus felt a cold weight settle in his chest. They can't do that. I own this land. The damn valve is mine. The lake touches their resort, yes, but it's mine too. Legally, yes. Practically, they're throwing resources at this that you can't match on your own, Tasha explained. You need a plan. Fast. Marcus hung up, feeling the pressure building like a storm behind his eyes. The HOA had just escalated things to a level he hadn't anticipated. And now it was clear. They weren't just trying to maintain their resort. They were trying to crush him, silence him, erase him entirely. The next morning, Marcus went to the barn site. Not that there was much left, just charred wood, splintered beams, and memories he could never replace. He knelt down, running his hands over the soil, inhaling the faint scent of smoke still lingering. That barn had been his father's, his grandfather's, his family's anchor, and it had been taken from him without hesitation. Anger surged, hotter and more electric than before. But this time, it wasn't just anger, it was focus, strategy. He couldn't afford to be reckless. Not yet. Not when the stakes had risen. He walked down the familiar path to the lake, the reeds brushing his arms, the sun sparkling off the water. The valve was still there, rusted and worn, waiting. And now, it wasn't just a symbol. It was a potential instrument of leverage, a way to fight back that didn't rely solely on fists or anger. Marcus spent hours studying the dam, noting how the water flowed, how fast it could rise, how long it would take to divert. He jotted diagrams in a notebook, marking potential weak points, escape routes, and areas of caution. He wasn't planning destruction. He was planning influence, a way to make the HOA understand, in real terms, that their arrogance had consequences. But Marcus wasn't alone in his thinking. Word of the barn's demolition had begun to circulate beyond the small town. Local activists, community leaders, even a few journalists reached out. They weren't offering direct intervention. They couldn't. But they were offering something just as important: awareness, witnesses, attention. One of them, a young reporter named Keisha Thompson, met Marcus at the edge of the lake that afternoon. Her camera slung over her shoulder, her eyes sharp, inquisitive. "Marcus," she said, voice steady, "I've been following the story. The barn, the HOA. It's outrageous. You've got rights, and people need to know about this." Marcus nodded cautiously. "I'm not trying to make headlines. I just want accountability. They can't just destroy someone's life and think it's business as usual." Keisha smiled faintly. "Sometimes stories like this, they're the only way to get people to notice, especially when power is being abused." For the first time in days, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't completely alone. Maybe he didn't have to fight this battle in silence. But as the sun began to dip behind the trees, shadows stretching long over the water, Marcus felt that familiar weight return. Gerald Simmons, the contractors, the lawyers, the HOA board, they were preparing, watching, waiting. And Marcus knew one thing for certain: whatever he did next, it would have consequences. And that's when the twist hit. Late that evening, a neighbor knocked on Marcus's door. It was Linda Crawford, a woman whose family had lived in the area for decades. She was normally quiet, polite, but tonight her face was pale, her hands trembling. "Marcus, you need to know. I overheard them today," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Gerald, the board, they're planning to escalate more than just legal action. They're talking about draining part of the lake, rerouting water, even filing claims that the valve is unsafe. They want to make it look like you're the threat, not them." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. Every strategy, every careful observation, every potential move, they were anticipating him. They weren't just defending their resort. They were weaponizing the lake itself to maintain control. He ran a hand through his hair. They can't do that. That water feeds the entire area. That's not just about me. It's the community." Linda nodded. "I know. That's why I came to you. They can't know I told you. But, Marcus, you have to act fast. Fast. That word reverberated in his skull. There was no more waiting. No more cautious observation. If the Hoe could weaponize the lake against him, then he needed to move before they could act. He returned to the edge of the water, staring at the valve, the reeds, the shimmering surface of Lake Silverwood. The calm lake belied the storm beneath, the potential energy, the weight of the injustice, the history it represented. Marcus realized, in that moment, that his next move wouldn't just be about revenge. It would be about asserting power in a world determined to take it away. And that's when he made the decision. Not reckless, not vengeful, not yet, but deliberate, strategic, calculated. He would use the valve. He would harness the water. And he would make the Hoe face the reality of their actions. The twist wasn't just in the stakes. It was in the revelation that Marcus held the power to shift the balance. And for the first time, he saw the possibility of turning the tables, of reclaiming control in a world designed to strip him of it. But he also knew one terrifying truth. The next move, the first real action, could change everything. It could expose him. It could escalate the conflict beyond his control. Yet standing there, water glinting like molten silver under the moon, Marcus felt a clarity he hadn't felt since childhood. The barn had been destroyed. The Hoe had underestimated him. And the lake held the leverage he needed. Somewhere, in the distant resort lights, Gerald Simmons was sleeping soundly, confident in his control. But Marcus smiled faintly. By morning, everything could be different. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And Marcus Reynolds was about to make the first bold move of a conflict that would ripple far beyond one barn, one lake, and one man's anger. The morning air was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of wet earth and the lake's cool undertone. Marcus Reynolds walked along the narrow trail that led to the valve, his mind racing with every scenario. He had spent nights mapping the lake in his head, considering how water could flow, how fast it could rise, and the paths it might take. But planning alone wasn't enough. He needed allies. He needed information. And most importantly, he needed control. His first visit that day was to Tasha Coleman, his attorney. She had become more than a legal advisor. She was a confidant, a strategist, someone who understood that this battle wasn't just about law. It was about power and perception. "Marcus, you have to be meticulous," she said, spreading papers across the kitchen table. "The Hoe thinks this is just a minor nuisance. But if you act strategically, you can expose their hypocrisy, their overreach. But any misstep, it could backfire." "I know," Marcus said, leaning over the table. "I've been thinking in terms of leverage, not chaos. I'm not out to hurt anyone. Just make them face reality. Make them see the consequences of what they did." Tasha nodded, impressed by his focus. "Good. And I've been tracking their permits, their lake maintenance schedules. They're planning modifications next week. New pathways, landscaping, even minor dam work. Timing will be key. You act too early, you risk drawing legal fire. Too late, they could secure the lake and make it impossible to use the valve." Marcus absorbed every detail. He loved planning. Every blueprint, every map, every observation became a piece in a puzzle that he was determined to solve. Afterward, Marcus visited a few trusted neighbors. Some were hesitant, wary of crossing the Hoe, but others, older residents who had seen this town change, seen power shift toward moneyed outsiders, offered quiet support. "They can't push you around forever," said Mr. Jenkins, the retired engineer. "But you need precision, Marcus. One wrong move, and they'll spin it like you're the villain. I can help you understand the dam mechanism, how to manipulate flow without causing damage." Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. He wasn't alone. There were people who understood, people who were willing to support him. Allies, strategy, and foresight. This was no longer a fight born of anger alone. It was a calculated battle. By midday, Marcus returned to the lake, crouching behind the reeds. He studied the valve, its rusted metal handle glinting in the sunlight. The lake stretched wide and calm, reflecting the HOA's pristine resort homes like a mirror. Every contractor, every board member, every polished suit on that property represented the opposition. But Marcus had something they underestimated: knowledge of his land, history, and leverage. He traced the flow of the water in his mind, imagining the subtle manipulations he could make, diverting the lake slightly, slowing the flow, creating pressure where it mattered, not to destroy, but to send a message, a controlled ripple that could shift attention, force accountability, demand a reaction. As the sun climbed higher, Marcus's focus sharpened. He wasn't thinking about anger anymore. He was thinking about outcomes: justice, dignity, power. The first small victory came unexpectedly. While observing the lake from his vantage point, Marcus noticed a contractor leaving a valve cover unsecured. Something minor, almost careless. But for him, it was a doorway. He quietly approached, inspecting the mechanism. With careful hands and the knowledge Jenkins had shared, he realized the potential to manipulate the flow without causing harm, just enough to make them notice. By evening, he returned home, exhausted but exhilarated. He had a plan forming, a way to make the hosts see that their arrogance had limits. But the plan required precision, timing, and courage. Any misstep could lead to legal trouble, or worse. That night, Marcus called Keisha Thompson, the reporter who had shown interest in his story. "Keisha," he said quietly, "I think it's time people knew what's going on here. Not just my barn, but the HOA's overreach. I'm planning to act, but I need witnesses, accountability." Keisha paused. "Marcus, I'm not sure you understand what that means. If this escalates, you could be in serious trouble. But if you handle it right, it could be the story people need to see." "I know the risks," Marcus said. "I've weighed them. I can't let them get away with this." By the next morning, the stage was nearly set. Marcus had studied schedules, identified weak points in the HOA's security, and solidified his network of allies. Jenkins provided technical guidance on the valve. Tasha kept tabs on legal ramifications. Keisha and a few others were ready to document everything if necessary. Marcus returned to the edge of the lake, crouching low behind the reeds. He could hear the distant hum of the resort, the laughter of families, the splash of children playing, the calmness of a world oblivious to the tension simmering just beyond the shoreline. He examined the valve again. Rusted, moss-covered, and old, it was a symbol of opportunity. The first real confrontation would happen soon. Timing, precision, and control would decide whether Marcus could assert himself without endangering anyone, or whether the hope would find a way to crush him before he could act. But even as he planned, doubt crept in. Was he ready? Could he maintain control if things spiraled? Could he make a stand without becoming the villain they would paint him as? Those questions gnawed at him as he watched the sun set behind the distant resort homes. The light reflected in the water, casting long shadows across the lake, the reeds, and the rusted valve. It was beautiful, deceptive, and dangerous. And then, as darkness settled over Lake Silverwood, Marcus made his decision. He would act, but he would act smart. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of justice, dignity, and the need to reclaim what was his. The pieces were in place, the allies ready, the plan forming. The confrontation was coming, and Marcus Reynolds had never been more determined in his life. Somewhere across the lake, unaware of the storm gathering, Gerald Simmons and the whole board continued their plans, confident in their control. But they didn't know the man they had underestimated. They didn't know that Marcus Reynolds had the knowledge, the resolve, and the power to make them see the consequences of their actions. By the time the moon rose over Lake Silverwood, Marcus sat on the shore, eyes fixed on the valve, fingers tracing its rusted handle. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with focus. The moment was approaching, the confrontation that would force the whole to reckon with what they had done. And Marcus knew one thing for certain. When it happened, there would be no turning back. The night air was still over Lake Silverwood, thick with anticipation. Marcus Reynolds crouched behind the reeds, the rusted valve at his fingertips, and the cool water lapping quietly at the shore. Moonlight reflected off the lake's surface, creating a deceptive sense of calm. But Marcus knew better. The calm was a mask, and beneath it, a storm was ready to erupt. He took a deep breath, feeling every heartbeat reverberate in his chest. His fingers brushed the metal of the valve, rough and cold, corroded with age, but sturdy. The knowledge Jenkins had shared, the planning he and Tasha had executed, every observation over the past week, it all led to this moment. Somewhere across the lake, the HOA's contractors had set up temporary monitoring equipment, checking water levels, reinforcing pathways. Gerald Simmons, confident as ever, had made rounds earlier in the evening, ensuring his resort appeared untouchable. He didn't suspect Marcus was ready, and that was Marcus's advantage. He glanced over his shoulder at the dark outline of the barn ruins. Memories surged through him. The smell of sawdust, the sound of hammers pounding, his father's voice teaching him the value of patience and hard work. That barn hadn't just been wood and nails. It had been his legacy. And now, he had a chance to reclaim some measure of justice, not through destruction, but through strategy and exposure. Marcus adjusted his grip on the valve handle, slowly, carefully, every movement deliberate. The plan was simple, precise. Divert the lake's water slightly, just enough to create disruption near the HOA's resort edge, to draw attention to the imbalance and force the board to recognize his rights. No flooding, no danger, just leverage. He began to turn the valve. The metal groaned, rust grinding against rust. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The reeds rustled softly as if whispering caution, warning him that the moment had arrived. Across the lake, a faint splash echoed. Someone was on patrol, likely a contractor checking the edges. Marcus froze. Time stretched, every second amplified. If he moved too fast, too slow, the plan could fail. He steadied himself, focused, breathed, then turned the valve just a little more. The water shifted imperceptibly at first, a subtle ripple near the HOA's resort edge. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't destructive, but it was noticeable. A contractor squinted toward the edge, muttering under his breath, and began walking over to investigate. Marcus's heart pounded, every nerve alive. This was it, the culmination of days of anger, planning, and determination. Every moment had led to this confrontation. Every step had been deliberate. Suddenly, a flashlight beam cut across the reeds. Gerald Simmons' voice rang out, sharp and commanding. Marcus, step away from the valve. Now. Marcus didn't flinch. His hands tightened on the handle. I'm on my property, he called back, voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. I've done nothing wrong, but you need to see the consequences of your actions. A contractor ran toward him, shouting. Another joined. The reeds bent under their weight. Marcus's pulse raced. He could feel their panic, their confusion. They didn't know whether he was about to sabotage the lake or simply exercise his rights, but the uncertainty gave him leverage. He turned the valve a fraction more. Water flowed, guided by physics and gravity, pushing subtly toward the HOA's property lines. Nothing catastrophic, nothing illegal, but enough to make them notice, enough to create disruption. Gerald reached the edge, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief. Marcus, you're interfering with the lake. That's illegal. Step away. Marcus met his gaze. Illegal? Or inconvenient for you? You tore down my barn, ignored my rights, and now you want to tell me what's legal? Justice isn't about your convenience. It's about fairness. Tension cracked through the night air like a whip. Contractors paused, uncertain, watching both men caught in the storm of confrontation. The waters shimmered under the moon, reflecting anger, determination, and the weight of history. Then Marcus did something unexpected. He didn't escalate further. He didn't push for chaos. Instead, he signaled to Keisha Thompson, who had arrived quietly to document the scene. Her camera clicked, capturing every moment. The valve, The lake. Gerald's furious expression. The contractors frozen in shock. "Do you see now?" Marcus said, voice rising with conviction. "Do you see what you tried to erase? What you tried to destroy? I haven't harmed the lake. I haven't harmed anyone. But I've made you notice. I've made you accountable." Gerald's face twisted, rage simmering. "You think this proves anything? You're lucky I'm not calling the cops right now." Marcus didn't waver. He had anticipated this. He had anticipated the outrage, the bluster, the attempts to intimidate. "Then maybe you should start thinking about fairness instead of fear," he said calmly. The water continued to shift subtly, flowing toward the edges, a tangible reminder of Marcus's control, his understanding, and his resolve. It wasn't destructive. It wasn't chaotic, but it was undeniable. A message delivered silently, powerfully, through action rather than words. Then came the breakthrough. A few neighbors, quietly observing from a distance, began to murmur, pointing out inconsistencies in the HOA's claims. Photos and videos taken by Marcus and Keisha circulated quickly, even among some of the resort residents who hadn't realized the extent of the HOA's overreach. The optics were shifting. Public opinion was turning. Gerald Simmons' fury became visible. The carefully maintained image of authority began to crumble. For the first time, he looked uncertain, exposed. Marcus could see it in his eyes. A flicker of doubt, the recognition that control had slipped. Marcus stepped back, hands still on the valve, breathing steadily. "I've shown you the consequences of ignoring history, of dismissing someone's legacy, of abusing power," he said. "Now it's your choice. Fix it. Apologize. Acknowledge what you've done, or face scrutiny for every action you take from here on out." The night seemed to hold its breath. The lake shimmered, quiet now, almost reflective of the tension. Gerald's jaw tightened, and he turned sharply, barking orders at the contractors. But the damage was done. The HOA's authority, their unchallenged control, had been questioned, exposed, and undermined in the court of public opinion. Marcus slowly released the valve handle, letting it settle. The water returned to its natural rhythm. Nothing catastrophic had happened, yet the statement had been made. He had taken action without destroying anything, without causing harm, and yet made the Ho confront the reality of their overreach. The contractors backed off, murmuring among themselves. Gerald Simmons stormed back toward the resort, muttering under his breath. Marcus watched him go, a sense of satisfaction coursing through him. Not vengeance, but justice. Keisha Thompson approached, camera in hand, documenting every detail. "Marcus, this is incredible," she said. "You didn't hurt anyone, but you made them see." Marcus exhaled, the tension slowly draining. "That's all I wanted," he said. "To be seen, to be heard, to make them realize that what they did wasn't acceptable." The lake settled into stillness once again, moonlight dancing across the surface. Marcus looked out across the water, feeling a quiet sense of triumph. He hadn't just acted, he had acted wisely, deliberately, with justice and dignity guiding every move. And in that moment, Marcus Reynolds understood something profound. Power doesn't always belong to the loudest voice, the biggest bank account, or the sharpest suit. Power belongs to those who know how to wield it responsibly, strategically, and with purpose. The Ho had underestimated him. They had assumed he would break under pressure, lash out recklessly, or retreat quietly. But Marcus had done none of those things. He had acted, and in doing so, reclaimed his narrative, his dignity, and his legacy. The climax wasn't just the turning of a valve. It was the moment Marcus asserted control, demanded respect, and reminded everyone that justice could be delivered in subtle, undeniable ways. And as he stepped back from the reeds, the night quiet around him, Marcus knew the battle wasn't over, but the first round had been won. The morning after the lake confrontation, the world felt different. Marcus Reynolds woke to the hum of cicadas, the distant chatter of children along the lake, and the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. It was ordinary and quiet, yet beneath it all, the tension of last night lingered like a pulse. He stepped onto his porch, sipping a cup of coffee, scanning the horizon. Across the lake, the HOA's resort looked exactly the same, pristine and polished. But he knew the difference now. The calm surface hid uncertainty. Gerald Simmons' control had been challenged. For the first time, the HOA wasn't untouchable. A series of notifications buzzed on Marcus's phone. Emails, texts, and voicemails from neighbors, friends, and even some journalists. Keisha Thompson's article had gone live overnight. Local resident exposes HOA overreach at Silverwood Lake. Photos captured the valve, Marcus at the edge of the water, and Gerald's incredulous expression. Comments and shares poured in, framing Marcus as the courageous underdog standing up to systemic injustice. Marcus leaned back in his chair, absorbing it all. There was satisfaction, yes, but also a lingering unease. He had made his point, but he hadn't fully anticipated the scope of attention. His actions had been careful, controlled, but now that the story was public, scrutiny would come from every direction. By mid-morning, the first official reaction arrived. The HOA sent a representative to Marcus's property, not hostile, but formal, almost defensive. Gerald Simmons was there, flanked by lawyers and contractors. His smile, once so smug and assured, had been replaced by a tight-lipped tension. "Marcus Reynolds," Gerald said, voice steady but clipped. "We need to discuss what happened last night. Your actions created a significant disturbance, and there are questions about liability." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Disturbance? I didn't harm anyone. I didn't break anything. I simply made sure that the consequences of your actions were visible." Gerald's jaw tightened. He glanced at his team, signaling frustration. "You don't understand the legal ramifications. You interfered with the lake. That's, well, potentially serious." Marcus shook his head, leaning slightly on the railing of his porch. "You tore down my barn without warning, without justification, and expected me to stay quiet. I acted within my rights. I acted responsibly. And now, maybe, you understand that power has limits." The HOA's lawyers exchanged nervous glances. The optics were bad, very bad. Gerald sputtered, trying to regain control, but Marcus held firm. Every word, every stance, every calculated action had shifted the narrative. He wasn't just a man defending a barn. He was a man standing up to systemic injustice. And now, the world was watching. Neighbors began to gather at a safe distance. Some whispered encouragement. Others were curious onlookers. Even the contractor team hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. Marcus had demonstrated that careful action could disrupt authority without chaos or harm. It was an example that resonated with many, and it was hard to ignore. By the afternoon, Marcus had a message from Tasha Coleman. "Prepare for backlash. Expect calls from the whole board, possibly legal threats. But you also have leverage now. The optics are yours. Keep documenting everything." Marcus nodded to himself. He was ready. He had been preparing for this moment for days, weeks, even, and he wasn't about to back down now. The next phase of fallout came quickly. Social media attention increased. Local news stations picked up the story. Emails flooded the HOA office, questioning their overreach and demanding accountability. Residents of neighboring towns shared the story, framing it as a case of individual courage against systemic power. Inside the HOA office, tension was palpable. Gerald Simmons tried to spin the narrative internally, claiming Marcus's actions were reckless. But even some board members were hesitant to support him publicly. The optics of trying to punish a man who had acted responsibly, legally, and strategically were problematic. Back at Marcus's home, he observed all this with cautious satisfaction. He hadn't expected an immediate, sweeping victory, but the first cracks were forming. Gerald Simmons' aura of untouchable authority had been punctured. The HOA's narrative was no longer guaranteed. Marcus had shifted the balance of power, even if only slightly. By evening, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Linda Crawford, the neighbor who had warned him about the HOA's plans. She stood hesitantly at his gate, hands clasped, face anxious but relieved. "Marcus, "I saw what you did," she said quietly. It worked. They're starting to realize they can't just bulldoze over people like that anymore. Marcus smiled faintly. "I didn't do anything reckless. Just made sure they noticed. That's all." Linda nodded, visibly emotional. "You've given all of us hope. That someone can stand up. That someone can fight back." Marcus looked out over the lake as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the water in fiery oranges and deep purples. The lake, calm once more, reflected not only the sky but also the balance of power that had shifted overnight. It wasn't total victory, not yet, but it was a tangible sign that justice, dignity, and accountability could prevail. The following days were a whirlwind. Gerald Simmons attempted to resume control, sending formal letters, demanding meetings, and even suggesting mediation. Marcus, guided by Tasha, refused to engage on their terms, documenting every interaction and ensuring that the narrative remained focused on fairness and transparency. Neighbors, inspired by Marcus's actions, began quietly rallying support. Conversations around the town shifted from whispered disapproval to active acknowledgement that systemic bias and abuse of power could be challenged. Marcus had become more than a local resident defending a barn. He had become a symbol. At home, Marcus allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. The barn was gone. The HOA had tried to erase his legacy, but the lake, the valve, and the strategy he had executed successfully were reminders that courage, planning, and dignity could push back against injustice. Still, he knew the story wasn't over. Gerald Simmons and the HOA weren't finished. Legal threats, public pressure, and attempts at intimidation were likely still coming. But Marcus had learned something vital. Power wasn't about who controlled the lake, or who wore the suits, or who made the rules. Power was about knowledge, patience, and the courage to act when the moment was right. By the end of the week, Marcus walked along the lakeshore, observing the water's calm, listening to the faint hum of insects and the occasional splash of fish. He realized how far he had come, from anger, frustration, and helplessness to calculated action and tangible impact. And somewhere in the distance, the lights of the HOA resort twinkled like distant stars. Gerald Simmons and his team could no longer assume that control was absolute. Marcus had shifted the narrative, asserted his rights, and forced accountability. The ripple effect of that night would continue to spread through the community, the media, and even the HOA itself. For Marcus Reynolds, the fallout wasn't just about legal or social victories. It was about reclaiming his dignity, honoring his family's legacy, and showing that standing up to systemic injustice, when done wisely, could create real, lasting change. As the moon rose over Lake Silverwood, Marcus stood quietly, reflecting on the storm he had navigated. The confrontation had passed, but its effects would continue to unfold. And for the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace, tempered by the knowledge that vigilance, strategy, and courage were the keys to maintaining justice in a world too often tilted against the underdog. The days after Marcus Reynolds' decisive action at Lake Silverwood settled into a strange rhythm. The lake itself returned to its calm, reflective state, but beneath the surface, subtle changes rippled through the community. For Marcus, the immediate tension had eased, yet the effects of the confrontation continued to unfold in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. Neighbors who had once been hesitant to speak now approached him openly. Some brought words of encouragement. Others brought practical help, like repairing small sections of his land damaged during the barn demolition. Linda Crawford, in particular, became a steadfast ally, offering support and insight whenever she could. "You really changed things, Marcus," she said one afternoon as they walked along the lakeshore. The sun glinted off the water, giving it a silver sheen. "I've lived here 50 years, and I've never seen someone take a stand like this. People are talking. They're noticing." Marcus nodded, grateful but wary. "It's not over. Not entirely. The HOA will try to spin it, push back. But for now, we've got momentum." Momentum was important. It was tangible, but it also needed to be maintained carefully. Marcus understood that victories in the court of public opinion could be fleeting if not reinforced with consistent action and documentation. He began cataloging every interaction with the HOA, Every conversation with neighbors